Hello everyone, and welcome back. Picture a cold, grey shoreline somewhere in 9th century England. The air is thick with the metallic scent of recent battle and the salt of the North Sea. A man is dragged from a makeshift cell, his fine clothes torn and smeared with mud and blood. He is a king, or he was until the great heathen army arrived on his shores. Now he is nothing. He is pushed to his knees in the center of a circle of warriors. They are silent, their faces hard as the stones on the beach, their eyes cold, with a patience that is far more terrifying than rage. One man steps forward. He is a leader, a son avenging a father. He carries no sword, no axe. In his hands is a long, sharp knife. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. The king on the ground knows what this is. He has heard the whispers, the terrifying tales that travel on the wind from the north. He knows this is not a swift death. This is a ceremony, a message. The knife is laid against the skin of his back. Just beside the spine, it is brutally sharp. The first cut is made, then another on the opposite side. This is not a story about a simple execution. This is a story about a ritual so infamous, so utterly barbaric, that it has come to define an entire era. It is called the Blood Eagle, and for centuries we've believed it to be the ultimate expression of Viking fury. But what if the most terrifying thing about it isn't the act itself, but the possibility that it never happened at all? The legend of the Blood Eagle is not some vague piece of folklore. It is written down, recorded in the great epic poems and sagas of the Norse world. These are the stories the Vikings and their descendants told themselves about their heroes, their gods, and their enemies. And the most vivid, the most cinematic account of the Blood Eagle comes from a story of vengeance that has echoed through 1,000 years. It begins not with the victim, but with the architects of his demise, the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar, the Viking king, who supposedly terrorized England and France, was a force of nature. A man who, according to the Sagas, met his end in a way that was both ignominious and poetic, captured by King Ælla of Northumbria. An Anglo-Saxon ruler in the north of England, Ragnar was thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. As the serpents swarmed him, the sagas tell us Ragnar did not scream or beg. He laughed. He faced his death with defiance, promising that his sons, his young boars, would grunt and rage when they heard how their old father had been treated. It was a prophecy and a threat. And it was a threat that his sons would make good on. News of Ragnar's death travelled across the sea to his sons. There was Bjorn Ironside the warrior, Sigurd Snake, in thy marked by the image of the serpent Ouroboros in his pupil, and then there was Ivar the Boneless. A strange and enigmatic name for a strange and enigmatic man. Some stories say he was literally boneless, carried into battle on a shield, his body limp but his mind a razor, sharp weapon of strategy. Others suggest the name was a metaphor for his cunning, his flexibility, or perhaps even a cruel joke about his prowess in the bedroom. Whatever the origin, Ivar was the mastermind, and when he heard of his father's death, a cold, calculated fury took hold. He and his brothers assembled a fleet unlike any seen before. It wasn't a raiding party, it was an invasion force. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, written by the terrified monks who watched it arrive, didn't call it an army. They called it the Great Heathen Army. A tide of Norsemen that washed over England in the year 865, not just for plunder, but for revenge. They landed in East Anglia and swept north, a storm of axe and sword. They marched on the kingdom of Northumbria, on King Ælla's capital York. The sagas paint a picture of utter chaos. Ælla was unprepared, his kingdom was fractured by civil war, and he had fatally underestimated the prophecy of the dying man in his snake pit. He was captured, the young boars had their prize. The story that follows, primarily from a 13th century Icelandic text called the Santale of Ragnar's Sons, Sant, is where the Blood Eagle is seared into our collective memory. The sons of Ragnar debated how to kill Ælla. They wanted something that would be remembered, something that would be remembered, something that would honor their father's defiant end. It was Ivar, the strategist, who supposedly decreed the method. The text, it says they caused the blood eagle to be carved on the back of Ælla, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. Think about that description. It's not just killing, it's deconstruction. The act begins with cutting the skin and muscles away from the spine. Then, one by one, the ribs are severed from the spinal column with an axe or a heavy blade and bent outwards, creating a gruesome parody of folded wings. The final, horrifying step, if the victim was still alive, was to pull the lungs out of the newly created cavity and drape them over the shoulders, over these newly formed wings. The saga suggests that the final fluttering convulsions of the dying lungs would mimic the beating of a bird's wings. It was a ritual, a sacrifice, perhaps to the god Odin, the All-Father, who was himself associated with eagles and sacrifice. It was the ultimate act of domination, a public spectacle designed to sow terror and cement the power of the Avengers. It was not enough to kill a king, his very body had to be reshaped into a monument of his own defeat. And the story of Ælla is. The blood eagle appears elsewhere, a recurring motif of ultimate vengeance in the Norse literary world. Take the Jontokninga saga Trot, the story of the powerful earls of Orkney. Here we find another tale of family feud and brutal retribution. Einar, the Earl of Orkney, captures Halfdan Halig, the son of the Norwegian king Harald Fairhair. Halfdan had murdered Einar's father, so this was, once again, about filial piety and revenge. The saga tells us that Einar performed the blood eagle on Halfdan. The description is slightly different, but no less horrifying. It mentions carving the eagle on his back with a sword, cutting the ribs, pulling out the lungs, and dedicating the victim to Odin as a victor's sacrifice. Here again, it's not just murder, it is a religious act, a tribute to the god of war and death. It reinforces the idea that this was a known, if rare, practice within the pagan Norse world. Other potential references are more cryptic, harder to pin down. Some scholars have pointed to the death of the Anglos, Saxon King Edmund of East Anglia, who was also killed by the great heathen army. The earliest accounts say he was tied to a tree and used for archery practice by the Vikings before being beheaded. A martyr's death, but centuries later new details creep into the story. Some later accounts claim his back was scourged so deeply that his ribs were exposed. Was this a memory of the blood eagle, distorted over time, or was it simply a later writer adding gruesome details to embellish the story of a... The ambiguity is part of the problem. The lines between history, hagiography, and epic storytelling are incredibly blurred. These stories, especially the tale of Ivar and Tala, became the bedrock of the blood eagle legend. They were repeated, retold, and eventually accepted as historical fact. They perfectly encapsulated the popular image of the Viking, the godless berserker. It's a powerful image, a terrifying story. But what if that's all it is, a story? For a very long time, nobody really questioned it. The sagas were read, if not as pure history, then as texts containing a kernel of historical truth. The blood eagle was just one of the many brutal realities of a brutal age, but in the 20th century, historians and literary scholars began to look at these texts they started asking uncomfortable questions. And the first, most glaring problem they found was a matter of timing. The sagas, like the soundtale of Ragnar's sons Botten the Jontokninga saga Saut, were not written by eyewitnesses. They weren't even written in the Viking Age. They were written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, a full 200 to 300 years after the events they did. That is like someone today writing a detailed first-hand account of the Napoleonic Wars based on stories passed down through their family. How accurate would it be? And who were these writers? They weren't pagan Norsemen, they were Christians. They were learned Icelanders, looking back at their own pagan past with a mixture of pride, fascination, and Christian judgment. Their world was profoundly... They were part of mainstream European literary culture. They were writing epics, family histories that were meant to be as grand and compelling as any story from Greece or Rome. Their goal wasn't necessarily to record history with journalistic accuracy. Their goal was to entertain, to instruct, and to create a national literature for Iceland. And what makes a better story than heroic ancestors, epic battles, and acts of unimaginable vengeance? These saga authors were creating art, and art thrives on drama, on exaggeration, on powerful imagery. A simple execution is forgettable, a man being carved into the shape of a bloody bird. That's a story that will be remembered for 1,000 years. So the question becomes, were they recording a real pagan ritual, or were they inventing a dramatic literary device? This leads us to the second major problem. The sources themselves are inconsistent and often contradictory. The earliest accounts of the events, the ones written closer to the time, don't mention the Blood Eagle at all. Take the death of King Ælla, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. A contemporary English record simply says that the Viking army took York, and in the chaos of battle, both rival kings of Northumbria, including Tala, were slain. No mention of a capture. No mention of a snake pit for Ragnar, and absolutely no mention of a gruesome ritualistic execution. It describes a messy, chaotic battle, not a cold, calculated act of revenge. It's only in the later Norse sagas, centuries later, that the dramatic story of the Blood Eagle appears. It's as if the story grew more elaborate, more gruesome, with each retelling. Then there's the case of Saint Edmund. His martyrdom was recorded by a man named Abbo of Fleury about a century after it happened, based on an eyewitness account. Abbo provides a detailed description of Edmund being beaten, shot with arrows until he looked like a hedgehog, and then beheaded. It's a horrific story designed to emphasize his suffering and faith, a classic piece of Christian hagiography. The detail about his back being scourged to expose his ribs only appears in texts written long after Abbo's account. This pattern is suspicious. If this spectacular ritual was a real and known Viking practice, why do the contemporary sources, the people who were actually there, fail to mention it? It's like a massive crime scene, with no witnesses. The story only emerges generations later, told by people who weren't there, and who had every reason to make their ancestors, or the enemies of their saints, seem larger than life. This is where the historical detective work gets really interesting. The case against the Blood Eagle isn't just about late sources. It is about language it sources. It is about the possibility that we, and the saga writers before us, have been the victims. To understand this, you have to understand the language of the Vikings, Old Norse, and specifically their poetry. Viking Age poets, known as skalds, didn't write like we do. Their poetry was a complex, intricate art form, almost like a secret code. It was governed by strict rules of meter and alliteration. And most importantly, it was built on a foundation of elaborate metaphors called kennings and symbolic words called rite. A kenning is a compound phrase used in place of a simple noun. For example, a skald wouldn't just say the sea, he might call it the whale road. A warrior wasn't a warrior, he was a feeder of ravens. A battle wasn't a battle, it was a storm of swords. This was the height of literary art. The more complex and clever the kenning, the more skilled the poet. It was all about showing off, about painting a picture with words in a way that was both beautiful and brutal. So, what if the Blood Eagle was never a literal instruction for torture? What if it was a kenning, a piece of poetic imagery that was later misinterpreted as a real event? This is the theory put forward by several prominent scholars, most notably Roberta Frank. The theory goes like this. The original phrase might have been something like art starten sat baki, which translates to carve an eagle on the back. For a Christian saga writer in the 13th century, unfamiliar with the deep nuances of pagan era poetry, this might sound like a literal description of a ritual description of a ritual. An eagle is a carrion bird. It feeds on the dead left on a battlefield. To carve an eagle on a man's back could simply be a powerful poetic way of saying you killed him brutally in battle, face down in the mud, and left his corpse for the eagles to feast on. The eagle is carved on his back by the beaks and talons of the bird itself. It's a savage, powerful image of total victory and desecration. It conveys the same message of ultimate vengeance as the literal ritual, but without the need for an anatomically impossible procedure. Another scholar, Alfred Smith, proposed a similar but slightly different idea. He argued that it might refer to a specific type of battlefield wound. A warrior struck in the back with a broad, bladed Viking axe would suffer a catastrophic injury. The deep, wide wound, cleaving through the back and ribs, could, in the mind of a poet, resemble the shape of a folded eagle. So, the Blood Eagle wasn't a post-capture ritual. It was a name for a death, blow delivered in the heat of battle. It's still brutal, but it transforms the event from a cold, ceremonial torture into a fleeting moment of battlefield violence, later immortalized in poetry. This linguistic argument is incredibly compelling. It suggests that the saga writers working centuries later took this powerful piece of figurative language and, through a combination of misunderstanding and a desire for a good story, literalized it. They heard carve an eagle on his back, and their imagination, colored by tales of martyrdom and medieval torture, filled in the gruesome details. They became the unwitting inventors of history's most terrifying execution. If the literary and linguistic evidence casts serious doubt on the Blood Eagle, what about the physical evidence? Surely, if people were having their ribs and lungs removed, it would leave a mark. This is where archaeology and forensic science enter the investigation. An execution like the Blood Eagle would not be subtle. It would leave a very specific and dramatic set of marks on the skeleton of the victim. Archaeologists and forensic anthropologists know what they're looking for. They would be searching for clear, sharp cut marks on the ribs near where they connect to the thoracic vertebrae of the spine. These cuts would have to be distinct from battlefield injuries. They wouldn't be random slashes. They would be systematic evidence of a deliberate and methodical process. They might also look for damage to the vertebrae themselves, perhaps from the final, forceful prying of the rib cage. A skeleton is a history book written in bone, and a story this violent would be written in capital letters. So have we found it. With all the thousands of Viking Age skeletons that have been unearthed across Scandinavia and the British Isles, have we ever found a single individual who shows signs of having been subjected to the Blood Eagle? The answer is a simple and resounding no. Not one. There is absolutual evidence. We have found Viking Age mass graves, we have found skeletons with horrific battle wounds, skulls cleaved by axes, bodies riddled with arrowheads. We have found evidence of other pagan rituals, of sacrifices and strange burial practices. But we have never found a Blood Eagle victim. This is what is known as an argument from silence, and while it is not definitive proof in itself, absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. It is incredibly damning for a ritual that was supposedly famous enough to be recorded in multiple sagas. A signature move of Viking vengeance, you would expect to find at least one body, just one piece of bone with the right cut marks to turn myth. And there is nothing. Beyond the silence of the boneyards, there is another, perhaps more fundamental, scientific objection. It's a question of basic human anatomy and physiology. Could the Blood Eagle even be performed as described? Could a person remain alive long enough for the final, theatrical presentation of the lungs? A team of researchers, including medical doctors and an anatomist from the University of Iceland, they published their findings in 2022. They looked at the procedure step by step, analyzing it not as a literary trope, but as a surgical event. Their conclusions were stark. The procedure would be almost impossible to perform in the way the sagas describe. Severing the ribs from the spine would require immense force and would likely cause massive trauma to the surrounding organs and major blood vessels. Even if this were done with some precision, the moment the chest cavity is opened up in such a dramatic fashion, the lungs would collapse. The victim would suffer from what is called a bilateral pneumothorax. They would be unable to breathe. On top of that, the massive blood loss from severed intercostal arteries and the shock to the nervous system from the damage to the spinal column would be catastrophic. So how long would the victim survive? Minutes at best. Most likely, they would lose consciousness almost immediately from the initial shock and blood loss. The idea of the victim remaining alive, let alone conscious, to the point where their lungs could be pulled out and draped over their shoulders, is pure medical fantasy. And the final detail, the fluttering of the lungs like wings. That's also impossible. Once the lungs have collapsed and the victim has died from asphyxiation and exsanguination, there would be no breath, no movement, just limp, dead tissue. The medical analysis concludes that while the initial stages of the torture, the carving of the back and perhaps the breaking of some ribs, are plausible. The full ritual, as depicted in the sagas, is a biological impossibility. It could not have happened. It is a procedure born from the imagination, not the operating theatre. It is a literary creation, designed for maximum horror and symbolic weight, unconstrained by the messy realities of the human body. So where does that leave us? We have a collection of stories written down centuries after the fact by Christian authors looking back on a pagan past they barely understood. We have a compelling linguistic theory that suggests the entire legend is based on a misinterpretation of complex, figurative poetry. We have a complete lack of any archaeological evidence from the thousands of skeletons that have been examined. And we have a modern medical consensus that the full procedure is anatomically impossible. The case against the blood eagle being a real historical practice seems overwhelming. The evidence points not to a ritual of blood and bone, but to a myth of paper and ink. But if it's a lie, why was it created, and why has it endured for so long? The answer tells us less about the Vikings themselves and more about how we see them and how they saw themselves. For the Christian writers in Europe who were the Vikings' victims, the blood eagle was a perfect piece of propaganda. It confirmed these weren't just raiders or soldiers. They were monsters, heathens, demons in human form who performed unspeakable rites for their dark gods. The blood eagle was proof of their otherness, a justification for holy war against them. It helped draw a clear line in the sand. On one side, civilized, God-fearing Christendom, on the other, savage, pagan barbarism. But the truly fascinating part is that the Vikings' own descendants, the Christian Icelanders who wrote the Sagas, also embraced this story. Why would they portray their own ancestors in such a monstrous light? Because for them the Viking Age was a heroic age. It was their equivalent of the age of Achilles and Odysseus. Their ancestors weren't supposed to be reasonable or gentle. They were supposed to be forces of nature, figures of terrifying power, of primal rage and epic vengeance. A man like Ivar the Boneless performing the blood eagle wasn't a sadist. He was an epic hero carrying out a righteous, if terrifying, revenge for his father. The sheer brutality of the act wasn't a stain on his character. It was a testament to his power and the depth of his love for his father. The blood eagle made the Viking past more epic. It transformed them from mere historical figures into mythological archetypes. And that's a powerful temptation for any storyteller. So in the end, we are left with a ghost, a phantom ritual that likely never was, but which has haunted the shadows of history for a millennium. The blood eagle, as a literal anatomical procedure, performed most certainly a myth. It is a literary legend, born from a potent cocktail of misunderstood poetry, Christian propaganda, and the Icelanders' own romanticized view of their pagan past. It is a story about a story, but that doesn't make it any less significant. The endurance of this myth tells us something profound about our fascination with the dark side of history. We are drawn to the extremes of human behavior, to the stories that test the limits of what we believe is possible. The blood eagle is the ultimate Viking story, not because it's true, but because it perfectly encapsulates the image of the Viking that has been constructed in our collective imagination, vengeful, terrifying, and utterly uncompromising. The truth is often quieter, messier, and less cinematic than the legend. King Ælla was likely killed unceremoniously in the mud and chaos of a battlefield. Halfdan Halig was probably dispatched with a simple sword thrust, but those mundane realities were not good enough for the storytellers. They needed something more. They needed a symbol, and so they created one. They took a whisper of poetry, a metaphor for a brutal death, and they breathed a terrible life into it. They gave it wings, and the blood eagle took flight, soaring out of the pages of the Sagas and into our nightmares. A terrifying, beautiful, and utterly brilliant lie. The real mystery isn't whether the blood eagle happened. The real mystery is why we still need it to have happened, why we are so captivated by this perfect, impossible horror. That is all for today. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.